Hello, everybody. Welcome to the History Valley podcast. Today, frequent guest of the show, James Valliant, joins us once again to talk about what convinced him that mythicism is basically impossible.
Well, I think a word like impossible is a very strong one,
It certainly is.
but following my recent discussion, you hosted a recent discussion between me and Dr. Adair
Yeah.
on uh, historicism, and one of the issues that you wanted to stress with me actually afterwards was a certain point about the nature of crucifixion itself, and it's true that we were just in fact discussing scholars who say that Jesus may have only been hung on a tree or a pole and executed in some other way, such as stoning. But unfortunately, that's not what the tradition says. Um, uh, Paul would have mentioned a stoning, it seems to me, but he mentions only a staros upon which Jesus was hung, and not hung subsequently, but apparently this was the means of his execution. And if there's anything to the testimonium, then it's a Pilate execution. And if it's a Pilate Roman execution, then it surely wasn't a stoning, but a crucifixion. And if there's anything that we can associate with the gospel tradition and the earliest tradition at all with Jesus, if there's one thing that maybe we can land on, it's this tradition that he was crucified. And that presents a certain problem. If Jesus was in fact crucified, and I have to think he was, because we would have been told about a story about a stoning. We're already told that the Sanhedrin was involved. Why not tell us that if he was stoned, that the Sanhedrin stoned him, unless we're
Right.
adding Pilate for some
And
reason I
wouldn't
can't.
and that would have supported Paul's argument in 1 Thessalonians 2:13 to 16 that the Jews had killed Jesus.
Right.
But he never says that the Sanhedrin was organized and stoned Jesus. He would have used that as evidence. But and I know this is a pseudepigraphical Pauline epistle, but in 1 Timothy 6:13, we already got what appears to be a pre-gospel mention of Pilate being involved in some way with the execution of Jesus.
And if Pilate was involved in some way, then that supports the idea of a crucifixion. And
Yeah.
why would Paul have to be vague about the powers of the age that killed Jesus if it hadn't presented a problem? This crucifixion is a problem that he has to be vague about. We know his politics from Romans 13. Obey the Roman state as God's agents on earth. Don't rebel, pay your taxes, etc. And the consistent pleas for peace and getting along with the Romans throughout, the earliest New Testament tradition is pretty consistent. That being the case, it's pretty plain that a crucifixion presents an ideological problem to such a nakedly pro-Roman partisan as Paul. Well, that's a lot of P's, almost alliteration.
Yeah.
But it does create a problem for Paul that he is vague about, it seems to me. And it's sufficient I think, the political nature of the execution of Jesus is sufficient to explain Paul's uncomfortable vagueness about the powers of the age that did do it in Jesus in his reference. But he doesn't mention a stoning, he mentions a staros. And the Josephus tradition seems to be as old as it gets in the gospel tradition, and maybe even goes back to the testimonium in Josephus, if anything does. Called the Christ and was executed by Pilate are probably the two most certain elements that were in any reference Josephus had. And more than that, the tradition, as early as the tradition is, I mean, say, for example, Tacitus, the thing he knows about Jesus, if he's confused about who started the Great Fire of Rome, which Christiani these were, the one thing he even knows is that Jesus Christ was executed in the time of Pilate. And that being the case, the uniformity of Christian tradition on this point, gospel, epistle, you name it, and our earliest mentions of Jesus from outside historians like Josephus and Tacitus, the crucifixion is probably the one historical fact, if it's true, that we have a historical Jesus, would be true of him.
And
Given,
some,
why would you invent that though?
right.
If you're truly a mythicist, if we're inventing a Jesus from scratch and we're Paul, let's say, whoever it was that was having the initial visions, whether they were it was pious fraud or intentional fraud or an interpretation of scripture, whatever the source of this myth of a Jesus, let's say we go with Carrier and he's executed in some other dimension in outer space or something. In fact, he's a being of outer space. He's not really a real being at all here on Earth. Why would you invent a crucifixion? A crucifixion. That poses a problem given the politics of Paul. If he had been an inventor of the idea, he surely would have said just stoned. It would have been far easier, would have been consistent with the theme. Think of how, for example, the Gospels stand on their head to blame the Jews and to put the finger. I mean, Judas betrays him, Peter denies him. As a climax of these rhetorical jousts with all these religious authorities, Jesus is arrested and tried for a violation of the Mosaic law in all four gospel accounts that we have, and in all the earliest Christian literature, by the way, not just our canonical gospels, but all of it is uniform about crucifixion under Pilate. Now, as I say, it is bizarre, almost fictional, how the Gospels stand on their heads to blame the Jews. They have the crowd demanding it 3 times angrily, crucify him, crucify him. Sure, we have a suggestion in one of the Gospels that it's the priests who set him up for it. Well, okay, so it's the priests who set him up. It's the further blames the priests. It would have been so much cleaner to have just had a stoning, stoned Jesus, than to have had than to invent a crucifixion. The people who would not invent a crucifixion are the people for whom it was a problem. And yet it's at that layer that we have the first references to a crucifixion. There's no earlier reference than in Paul and in the Gospels, and they're the very authors who are having such a headache explaining away Roman involvement. Paul has to be vague. The Gospels have to stand on their head to blame the Jews. In Matthew, we don't need Matthew's crowd to say, his blood is on us and on our children. We get it. That's the theme in the Passion narrative throughout the Gospels. So the Roman involvement is an ideological problem that neither the Gospel writers nor Paul could have themselves invented, it seems to me. So if you mean impossible in that sense, it is impossible for our first cited sources on the matter to be the source of it. Josephus was writing Roman propaganda. He would not have if he was helping invent a Jesus, he would not have included a crucifixion, because that only creates a problem for any Roman propagandist. And we know Josephus was a Roman propagandist. We know by content that the New Testament is, in effect, Roman propaganda. But so it's just the very problem that would cause Paul to be vague and for the Gospels to have to stand on their head so dramatically and make such a huge belabored point out of blaming the Jews. Well, if it's totally myth, and these guys are the ones creating it, it makes zero sense to me. No, we have to have, and if we have an execution by stoning, why would you invent a crucifixion? Let's say Jesus was actually stoned. Let's say, in fact, the historical Jesus did have a run-in with the Sanhedrin, who we know had Josephus cites the legal authority that the Jews had before the war to enforce Mosaic law. The Sanhedrin could have people stoned for blasphemy, adultery, you name it. The Mosaic law could be enforced. And Jesus, we're told in all four Gospels, is arrested by the Sanhedrin and convicted in a sort of midnight proceeding of violating the Mosaic law. Okay,
Right.
if that's the case, they would have had him stoned. They didn't need Pilate at all.
And Paul
Pilate's involvement is
mentions,
fiction.
and Paul mentions the Last Supper, and that Jesus was betrayed by somebody that he doesn't name.
Right. So if the Sanhedrin were the ones who wanted him dead, Pilate's involvement would be fiction. However, I think it far more likely to think the other way about. In other words, they were stuck with the crucifixion, they were stuck with Pilate, and now they're stuck. The Gospels are stuck explaining it away, and Paul is stuck being vague about the powers that actually executed Jesus. That vagueness and the elaborate explanation for why it was involved Pilate and was a crucifixion would have been unnecessary had they been the creators of the story. Had Jesus actually been stoned, then they could have been happy and lived with his stoning. So I can almost tell you right now that Jesus could not have been stoned. there would be no reason for these pro-Roman writers to have invented a crucifixion. Invented a crucifixion. And besides, if it had been Jesus' followers, why would they have invented a crucifixion?
Right.
Now, one could make an argument. One could make an argument that goes something like this. Isaiah's suffering servant has to be, quote, pierced for our transgressions. Right? Pierced for the transgressions of the people. Pierced could mean some kind of stabbing, spearing, crucifixion. It probably does not include a stoning. However, he has to be an innocent who is silent in the face of the accusation and executed. And I do believe that Isaiah's suffering servant provides a model that the gospel writers went by in creating the passion narrative. It fits too neatly. And an executed Jesus could have very easily, in history, a historically executed Jesus could have easily been seen by his followers as a suffering servant, fulfillment of that prophecy. And so you could say, well, if he was stoned, they might have to invent a crucifixion to make him pierced to fit that bill. But I don't see it working that way. I think anyone who would fit that bill would have had to have been pierced. In other words, it's only because a historical Jesus would be crucified that the people at the time would say, aha, look, it's Isaiah's suffering servant who's just been pierced for the transgressions of the people, making us worthy of the glorious messianic advent which Jesus is credited with predicting.
Right. That does make a lot of sense to me. And Tacitus, a lot of mythicists say Tacitus is not an independent source, and I don't agree with that because there are several things that Tacitus reports about Christ that are different than the way even Josephus expresses it. Tacitus says that not only did Christ deserve to be crucified at the hands of Pilate, but that the Christians, or which later copyists wrote Christians instead, and for those that aren't familiar with that, look at the differences between the Florence manuscript of Tacitus and the ones we have now. You'll see the differences. Now, according to Tacitus, Nero blamed the Christians, the followers of Christ, or Chrestus, which appears to say, which would suggest that Chrestus and Suetonius is the Christ in Tacitus. I believe this to be the case. This would mean that the followers of Christ were blamed for the fire of Rome, that fire at Rome in AD 64. Because that's what Tacitus says. Nero blamed them for causing the fire, the Great Fire.
And they were worthy of the horrific punishment that Nero dished out at them.
We don't see this ever talked about in both the New Testament and in Josephus.
No.
So that to me meets the criteria of an independent source from the sources we have.
Well, he certainly has a very independent source about the fire of Rome, other than Josephus. That has to, even if he had Josephus available to him, and it has been suggested by more than one scholar that Tacitus had Josephus available to him, we know Roman historians work.
He knows it. He knows a different way of looking at Christ than the other texts.
Very negative one.
So that's what it is.
Yeah, that doesn't seem probable. More than that, he appears to share Suetonius's confusion about these followers of Chrestus, or these Christiani, being violent. Now, scholars reject the idea that Suetonius's Chrestus could be our Jesus Christ because he's causing disturbances that so early in the 40s during the reign of Claudius. That by around 50,
I like
Claudius
to quickly add,
Jews, and mind you, all the Jews of Rome were expelled by Claudius because of disturbances instigated by this Chrestus fellow. It's not clear where or when this Chrestus was doing the instigating, but Suetonius suggests that violent disturbances during as early as the reign of Claudius in Rome caused. See, now that makes it very hard for the normal understanding of things, that Jesus' little obscure sect of pacifist Christians could be 10, 15 years after the crucifixion be causing such trouble in Rome and being violent and causing such trouble in numbers as far away as Rome as to cause all the Jews to be expelled by the emperor himself from the capital does seem strained credulity. And yet, about 14 years after Claudius's expulsion, Nero is plausibly blaming a group called the Christiani, And again, it seems hard to believe that an obscure pacifist sect, our New Testament Christians, could be either a plausible scapegoat or that there could be a plausible, not because they're not in favor of violence. And why would the Romans want to blame such pro-Roman pacifists as New Testament Christians anyway? But you also, can we have enough Christians of the Pauline type before most of the New Testament, before any of the Gospels has been composed by most standard scholarship, before most of the New Testament has even been composed by most New Testament scholars, thought in 64 that's implausible. So yet the Jewish rebellion breaks out just 2 years after the Great Fire of Rome. So who is Tacitus talking about? He's talking about the same people probably expelled by Claudius 14 years or so earlier, are messianic rebel
Right.
Jews.
I don't really see whatever choice there is for that. And by the way, what I wanted to say earlier is there are scholars that do believe that Christus and Christ are the
Oh,
same
yeah.
person.
Yeah, most scholars have a hard time with that identification, but it has been suggested that that is Jesus Christ. Yes, I'm not denying that that there are no scholars out there that say that, but most scholars have a hard time with the idea. But I reject the idea. If Jesus was a historical figure, and now I've just, as you point out, I pretty much now come down on the idea that a crucifixion is an unavoidable reality. And it's so unavoidable reality that Paul had to be vague about it, and the gospel writers have to explain it.
Now I'm going
Even
to read this from Professor Tabor's Paul and Jesus. This is on page 207. And this is what he says. There was a sizable Jewish population in Rome, with many synagogues. Suetonius, a Roman historian of the period, indicates there were heated disputes among the Jews of the city over Christus, which led to the Emperor Claudius banning them from the city precincts in AD 49. This is likely a reference to disputes within the various Jewish communities over the newly imported messianic faith in Jesus, i.e., Christus equals Christus, which had reached Rome by this time. According to the
Well,
book of
I'm
Acts,
much
when
more
Paul finally
inclined
did
to go
arrive
with what
around
Table's
58
saying
and
here.
58, under house arrest for fomenting disturbances in the temple at Jerusalem, he set up shop in a rented house and began presenting his gospel to the local Jewish population. These encounters resulted in heated disputes, leading Paul to denounce the Jews and vow that he would preach only to non-Jews in the future, Acts 28:23 to 28. So he does think that Christus is Christ.
Well, we have good reason to think that if and I'll go with Professor Tabor here, the Acts reference definitely shows that some of Paul's followers were among the Jews who were expelled from Rome. If among Paul's Christians are followers of Christus who were expelled from Rome under the Christus thing that Suetonius is talking about, unfortunately, Suetonius does not refer to it as a dispute among Jews. In fact,
Yeah.
Suetonius seems to land hard on a very different idea. All the Jews of Rome needed to be expelled, and Claudius apparently did a reasonable thing in doing so. In other words, doesn't in Suetonius's description, it doesn't point to divisions among the Jews, but a frightening unity among them that Claudius is responding to. In other words, it's not just a sect that's being expelled from Rome, but all the Jews that are being expelled from Rome. And Suetonius makes no reference to partisan disputes among the Jews. He says Claudius expelled the Jews because of violent disturbances instigated by Christus. That's what Suetonius says. Now, he makes no reference to this being a dispute among Jews. He makes no such reference to this being just a sect, and then proceeds to tell us that Claudius took what appears to be the logical step of expelling all the Jews from Rome, which suggests quite the opposite of it being a sectarian dispute in Suetonius's, at least in Suetonius's treatment of it, or Suetonius's mind. There's no such suggestion that Suetonius thought of it in those terms, as a dispute among Jews at all. If Professor Tabor sees a dispute among Jews, he's the one seeing it and assuming it. No, the Romans assumed that this Christus guy, those disturbances required the expulsion of all the Jews from Rome. Now, he's absolutely right. There were numerous synagogues and a large Jewish population, even in Rome by this point. But we do not have Pauline Christians at this point, and that's why most scholars will say, nor if we have Pauline New Testament type Christians, why should they be violent? Why shouldn't they be turning the other cheek and so forth, and submitting to the evildoer, and walking the extra mile for Rome? If the doctrines contained in the New Testament are actually those of Jesus, which I do not believe. See, this is what we have to, I think, confront. Scholars have shown that most of the sayings of Jesus as given in the New Testament could not plausibly have been spoken by a historical Jesus. I cite you to the Jesus Seminar, which has some 85% plus of his statements as being in, I've gone through this 1,000 times. Jesus' obiter dicta is pretty much invented for him. The stuff even that they say is most likely, even the Jesus Seminar said is most likely to go back to historical Jesus, I find to be the least likely. Render unto Caesar, it's not what you put into your body, but what comes out of your body, that kind of stuff. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Okay, well, if that's what Jesus was saying, anti-Torah, pro-Roman stuff, and that's what they regard as the most likely, no, that's not likely to have been said by a crucified Jesus. It seems unlikely to me that any messianic rebel figure who would have been crucified by Pilate would have uttered such pro-peace things. If there was a historical Jesus, he was part of the rebellion. He was a rebel. And Brandon's thesis on this, Eisenman's thesis on this, is where I have to go. Whatever other details we may agree or disagree about with Brandon or Eisenman, the historical Jesus was what we know from Galatians, Torah Orthodox. We know from the general idea of his movement that he was apocalyptic messianic figure. Those all suggest him to be a rebel. If you are a Torah Orthodox messianic apocalyptic Jew before the war in the 1st century AD, and you were crucified by Pilate, I will bet you right now that you were a rebel, and a rebel leader, and probably perceived by your followers as a suffering servant, and that might have inspired visions by his followers, as Paul describes. But Paul is the author of the anti-Torah stuff. Paul is the one who turns Jesus into a god. If Paul could have, he would have invented a stoning. If the gospel writers could have, they would have invented a stoning. If Jesus had been stoned by the Sanhedrin, they would have left it right there and untouched. So it seems to me that the crucifixion poses a problem for which there's no logical solution other than an actual historical crucifixion that we can't get around.
So that being said, I don't believe we discussed this yet. You've been preparing, as we discussed in our private talk, couple of private talks, one yesterday and another one a few days beforehand, in which you became convinced that mythicism is practically impossible. You were saying that you were preparing for the Dr. Carrier debate, and
Yes.
you were looking at the James passage, and you were saying that you noticed some things, especially looking at Origin, that reinforces the notion that the James passage is not an interpolation.
Right. Well, looking at the James passage, well, Dr. Adair, when we were discussing that very passage, he indicated that it might have been simply a personal dispute between the high priest and whoever this James was. Because it seems to me very unlikely that an enemy of the high priest Ananias, someone that Ananias wanted dead, that the other priestly establishment or the Romans would want this guy's brother to be a high priest. It seems ideologically unlikely to me. Well, he said, well, it could have just been a personal dispute, and he was just another member of the high priestly elite, himself a member of the establishment. Well, no. That seems to be contradicted by Josephus, when Josephus says that Ananias not only executed James, but some of James's followers. This says a couple of things, very important. James was a leader of an ideological movement. He had followers. And it was the movement that Ananias wanted to fight, not just the person of James. It was the movement that James was leading. And Ananias cannot plausibly have been alone on this. He must have had support from within the priestly establishment as well. So he's not only executing James, but he's executing a bunch of his followers at the same time. And this guy's the leader of a movement that is such a threat to Ananias that he wants these people dead. It's a life and death struggle that involves more than just one guy named James. The idea that they would appoint as high priest, as the successor to Ananias, the brother of the James who was just killed, the leader of a movement that is a life and death struggle between the high priests and this James movement, seems utterly implausible to me. It seems bizarre to think that the leader of a movement that is so opposed to Ananias that Ananias wants him and several of his followers dead. What kind of reprisals would the new high priest, this brother of James, have done? He would have wanted people executed for all the executions that were done of his brother and his friends. No, a life and death struggle 4 years before the outbreak of the Jewish war between the high priests and a movement leader at this time, and one that Josephus calls popular. So, and now, furthermore, do we have any hints as to the nature of the ideological movement that this James was leading? Because he had followers who were also executed. Why, yes, we do. Josephus spells it out. He says that those who were most concerned about the strict enforcement of the law thought the James execution to be unjust. Well, that fits perfectly with the James of Galatians. What is Paul arguing about with James and Cephas? The Torah, strict adherence to the law. Paul is anti-Torah or liberal in his Torah interpretation. James and Cephas are not. Therefore, that fits perfectly with the James of Galatians. They are the strict observers of the law. So we have a James who's the leader of a movement, who is apparently his movement are Torah strict, just like the James in Galatians is. The very issue that causes Paul to come into conflict with James, strictness over law. We're told that James's crowd are the ones strict over law. That fits the James we know. Yeah, we're talking about a rebel. We're not talking about a Hellenized liberal person from the priestly establishment at all. To put a Torah Orthodox movement leader as the next high priest would be highly improbable in my view. And the portrait that Josephus paints is consistent with the portrait of the James in Galatians. Now, obviously, as I pointed out to Dr. Adair, we're not told. I mean, it's a bizarre way of going about it anyway, if Dr. Carrier is right, to start out by identifying James as the brother of someone, and then to say that guy, repeat his name and his identifier later on and say that he was appointed high priest and leave it to the reader to infer that that's why he was appointed high priest, because he was the brother of this guy, like I told you earlier. Well, no, Josephus is a little kinder to his readers than that. He'll tell you, no, he would have done it like this. James, the son of Damnius, was executed by Ananias. And then when he introduces the new high priest, he would have said, and that is why Jesus, the son of Damnius, the brother of James, was appointed high priest. He wouldn't have left it to an inference like that. More than that, Josephus never repeats an identifier. And Dr. Carrier would have Josephus do that. He would have it go, James, the brother of Jesus, son of Damnius, and then repeat, Jesus, son of Damnius. That never, ever happens in Josephus. Josephus would say, the previous, aforementioned Jesus, brother of James, which would have then been the relevant thing, not who his father was. So, in fact, the logic is interesting because it gets it backwards. In saying at first that James was the brother of Jesus, this guy who Josephus may have mentioned earlier as having been executed, tells us why James was really executed. By removing that, Carrier removes the cause, any cause, because the only other thing Josephus tells us is that the charge that Ananias brought was trumped up. Well, if it was a trumped up charge, then why did Ananias want James killed? Why was he executed? Well, if he was the brother of this earlier guy who got executed, we're sort of building this enmity between Christ, his brother, James, and the high priests. So we have an explanation for it built in. Carrier removes the explanation for the execution altogether, so we're left with no explanation for the execution as well. So, but that's why it's so much more plausible as is James, the brother of Jesus called the Christ, was executed. Right. I understand why that would happen. Right? And then this other guy, Jesus, son of Damnius, was executed. No relation. It would have made far more sense to remind us at the time of his appointment as high priest that this Jesus was the brother of the James who had just been executed, rather than starting out the explanation that way. Why? To set up the appointment of this really short-lived high priest, Jesus, son of Damnius? Well, that seems like a bizarre procedure to explain the matter, doesn't it? No, it's bizarre. In fact, it's an unusual way of introducing someone at all, James, the brother of Jesus. Now, it's typical Josephine vocabulary, and it's typical Josephine logic. So often in Josephus, we're told that a person is worthy of their punishment by implication, and very often it's because of their treatment of good people. Herod Antipas being just a classic example of John the Baptist reference. We're told Antipas deserved the attack that he later got because he had killed a good man, John the Baptist. We're told repeatedly by Josephus similar things. There's the brother of the high priest who kills his brother. He is worthy of the punishment that he gets. We're told Herod the Great, Agrippa the First, they are worthy of the punishments they get. And so in classic Josephine logic, Ananias was worthy of being removed, but he also deserves more. What happens to Ananias? He's killed by the rebels quickly in the war around 68. That suggests further that James is being avenged by the rebels because James is regarded well by the rebels.
Yep.
Now, given all that, given the fact that I believe that we are sort of stuck with only a staros in Paul and not a stoning, Paul would have told us about a stoning, I think. The Gospels wouldn't have needed to have invented a crucifixion if there'd been a stoning. They would have returned to a stoning rather than have this huge elaborate explanation for why Pilate was innocent. It just seems extremely unlikely to me, well nigh impossible. We're stuck with a crucifixion, it seems to me. And if that's the one fact we know historically about Jesus, then I can almost guarantee that he was a militant, nationalist, Torah Orthodox, rebel leader, just as James was, just as no doubt John the Baptist was. But nothing like Paul in the New Testament. No, not like that Jesus at all. No, the exact opposite of that Jesus, who was Torah critical, pacifistic, anti-nationalistic, anti-sectarian, praising Roman centurions, telling you to pay your taxes, befriending tax collectors. That Jesus, the turn the other cheek and go the extra mile for the Romans Jesus, was not a rebel. But then again, that Jesus would have been very unlikely to have ever been crucified. The Romans would have given that guy a soapbox.
Yeah. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.